Her voice was a splinter of kindling, barely a whisper against the gruff laughter and the clinking of glasses that filled the saloon. "May I have your leftovers, sir?" she asked, and the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the feared black gunslinger to answer. But when he finally looked up, when he saw who she was, the iron fortress he had built around his heart began to crumble into dust. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments where are you watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. The dust of Redemption Gulch was a living thing, a fine red powder that clung to everything and everyone, a constant reminder of the barren land from which the town had been clawed. It settled on the sweat-slicked brow of Silas, a man who wore his name like a shroud. He pushed through the bat-wing doors of the saloon, and the noise within did not so much quiet as it did change its texture. Laughter became brittle, conversations grew shallow, and every eye, directly or indirectly, found him. He was a specter carved from shadow and steel, his duster the color of a stormy sky, his face a mask of hard-won indifference. The gun belt slung low on his hips was not an accessory. It was a statement, a grim promise whispered into the tense air. The weight of it was a familiar comfort, the only constant in a life of shifting sands and fleeting allegiances. He moved to the bar, his steps measured and deliberate, a predator in a room full of nervous prey. The bartender, a man whose face was a roadmap of compromises, served him a whiskey without a word. Silas took it, his gaze sweeping the room, cataloging the exits, the threats, the men who puffed out their chests and the men who shrank into themselves. They were all the same to him, part of a landscape he navigated but never belonged to. He ordered a steak, a rare luxury, not because he was hungry for the meat, but because he was hungry for the space it would afford him. A man eating a meal was a man to be left alone, a small island of civility in an ocean of potential violence. The plate arrived, sizzling and spitting, an obscene display of plenty in a town that felt perpetually starved. He ate slowly, methodically, his senses still on high alert. The clatter of his fork against the ceramic plate was unnervously loud in the charged silence. He could feel their judgment, their fear, their resentment. It was a poison he had learned to metabolize, turning it into the cold resolve that kept him alive. He was almost finished when the voice came from beside him, so soft it was nearly lost. It was a voice he had buried under years of gunfire and cheap whiskey, a melody from a song he had forced himself to forget. He froze, the fork halfway to his mouth. For a single, terrifying moment, the hardened shell of the gunslinger cracked, and the boy he once was looked out from behind his eyes. A boy who knew sunshine and laughter, a boy who had not yet learned that the world's kindness was a currency spent far too quickly. He turned his head slowly, the movement stiff, reluctant, as if fighting against the pull of a ghost. And there she was, Ilara. Her name was a silent prayer on his lips, a word that had no place in this life he had made. The years had been cruel, carving lines of hardship and hunger into a face that he remembered as being round with youth and bright with optimism. Her hair, once the color of spun corn silk, was now dull and thin, pulled back in a severe knot. Her dress was a patchwork of faded calico, clean but worn to the point of transparency. But it was her eyes that undid him. They were the same eyes, the color of a summer sky just before a storm, and in their depths he saw not just desperation, but a flicker of the same spirit he had once known. She did not recognize him. To her he was just another stranger, a monolith of danger and menace, her last, most desperate hope for a scrap of food. The irony was a bitter pill in his throat. He, Silas, the man who had fled a past she embodied, was now her final resort. The town watched, their collective gaze a physical weight. They saw a beggar and a killer, a fallen woman and a dark omen. They could not see the invisible thread that bound these two disparate souls together across a chasm of time and tragedy. He said nothing. Words were useless, inadequate things. They could not explain the fire, the flight, the reinvention. They could not bridge the gap between the boy who had promised to always protect her and the man who now pointed a gun for gold. Instead, he pushed the plate towards her, the rest of the steak, the potatoes swimming in gravy, a small mountain of sustenance. His gesture was stark, devoid of any warmth, yet it was the loudest thing he had said in a decade. She flinched, expecting a blow or a curse. When none came, she looked from the plate to his face, searching for something in his unreadable expression. Her hand, trembling, reached out and took it. Her fingers brushed his for a fleeting second, and a jolt went through him. A phantom memory of holding that same hand as they ran through fields of wildflowers. She murmured a thank you, her voice cracking, and retreated into the shadows from which she had emerged, leaving Silas alone at the bar, the ghost of her touch burning on his skin, the silence of the saloon now a deafening roar in his ears. He paid for the meal and the untouched whiskey, the coins ringing like funeral bells on the polished wood of the bar. He walked back out into the oppressive sun, the dust swirling around his boots. But he did not head for his horse. He couldn't. The encounter had unmoored him, dragging a lifetime of carefully buried memories to the surface. He was no longer just a gunslinger passing through. He was a man tethered to this place by a ghost from his past. He followed her, keeping to the shadows of the storefronts, his movements as silent and fluid as the specter everyone believed him to be. He needed to understand. How had the girl whose laughter was once the town's brightest treasure become a woman begging for scraps in a saloon? He watched as she hurried down a side alley, her shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow from the world itself. She didn't go far. Her destination was a lean-to shack at the edge of town, a structure that seemed to be held together by little more than stubbornness and prayer. It sagged against the more permanent building of the blacksmith, a parasite clinging to a host. He saw her pause at the makeshift door, take a deep breath, and paste a fragile smile on her face before entering. Through the single grimy window, Silas saw the reason for her charade. A small boy, no older than 5, with the same corn silk hair she once had, lay on a thin pallet on the floor. He was pale, his breathing shallow. Ilara knelt beside him, her movements filled with a desperate, tender grace. She offered him the food, her own hunger forgotten. The boy ate weakly, his eyes fixed on his mother's face with absolute trust. The sight was a dagger in Silas's gut. This was not just Ilara's suffering, it was a legacy of it, passed down to an innocent child. He leaned against the rough-hewn wall of a neighboring building, the sun beating down on him, but a different kind of fire was burning inside him. It was a cold rage, an emotion he thought he had mastered and weaponized. But this was different. It was personal. He stayed there for what felt like hours, a silent sentinel watching over the wreckage of a life he had once been a part of. He saw the town's other faces then, the secondary characters in this cruel play. The wife of the preacher walked by, her nose wrinkled in disgust as she glanced at the shack. 2 cattlemen laughed as they passed, one making a crude joke about the widow Thorne left behind. The general store owner, a man named Henderson, stood in his doorway, watching Silas with narrow, calculating eyes. Each glance, each whispered comment, was a testament to the town's character, a place that preyed on the weak and ostracized the fallen. They were all complicit in her degradation. They had watched her fall and had done nothing, perhaps even taken a grim satisfaction in it. And Silas, in his self-imposed exile, had been absent. He had run to save his own skin, leaving her to face the aftermath of the tragedy that had shattered both their lives. The guilt was a heavy cloak, far heavier than his duster. His surveillance was patient, a predator's stillness hiding a storm of thought. He needed to know the architect of her misery. It didn't take long. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the sky, a buggy pulled up near the shack, a fine, polished thing that was an affront to the poverty surrounding it. A man stepped out, large and imposing, dressed in a tailored suit that strained at the shoulders. He carried himself with the unshakable arrogance of a man who owned the ground he walked on. Silas recognized him instantly. Bartholomew Thorne. His hair was grayer, his face puffier, but the same predatory glint was in his eyes. He was the man who had loomed in the background of Silas's childhood, a constant, grasping presence. Thorne didn't knock. He pushed the flimsy door open and strode inside as if he owned the place, which, Silas suspected, he probably did. Silas crept closer, his hand resting instinctively on the butt of his pistol. He could hear Thorne's voice, a low, booming thing that dripped with condescension. "Henderson tells me you've been begging again, Ilara. We had an agreement." Ilara's response was too faint to hear, but the tone was one of desperate pleading. "The boy needs a doctor." Thorn's voice cut through the air. "The doctor needs payment. The debt needs payment. These are simple facts of life. Your father understood that. Before his misfortune." The mention of her father was a deliberate cruelty, a twisting of the knife. Silas's knuckles turned white where he gripped his gun. He could see their silhouettes through the grimy window. Thorn stood over her, a mountain of smug authority, while she knelt by her son, a portrait of utter helplessness. "I gave you a chance," Thorn continued, his voice softening into something even more sinister. "A roof over your head. Protection. All I ask for is a little gratitude, a little companionship." The implication hung heavy and foul in the small shack. Silas felt a surge of pure, unadulterated hatred. This was not just about a debt. It was about power, about a cruel man breaking a woman for his own gratification, using her past and her love for her child as his weapons. Thorn reached a hand out, intending to touch her shoulder. Elara recoiled, a small, sharp movement of defiance. Thorn laughed, a humorless, ugly sound. "Still proud, are we? Pride is a luxury you can no longer afford." He dropped a small, clinking bag onto the dirt floor. "For the boy. Don't forget who provides for you." With that, he turned and left, stepping back out into the evening air, a satisfied smirk on his face. He climbed back into his buggy and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and despair in his wake. Inside the shack, Silas could hear the sound he had been dreading, the quiet, choked sobs of a woman who had nothing left. The rage in Silas's chest solidified into a cold, hard purpose. The ghosts of the past were no longer just memories. They were a call to action. He had run from Thorn once. He would not run again. The sight of Thorn, a bloated spider spinning a web of debt and despair around Elara, ripped open a door in Silas's mind that he had nailed shut and barricaded for 15 years. The dust of Redemption Gulch dissolved, replaced by the smell of rich soil and sweet hay, the sounds of birdsong instead of bitter laughter. He was a boy again, not yet Silas the gunslinger, but simply Si, a lanky orphan taken in by the kindest man he had ever known, Elara's father Abram. The flashback was not a gentle memory, it was a violent immersion. He could feel the warmth of the sun on his back as he and Abram mended a fence, the calluses on the man's hands a testament to a life of honest work. Abram had never treated him like a charity case or a field hand. He had treated him like a son, teaching him to read from the family Bible, to ride a horse not with fear but with trust, and to see the value in a seed planted with hope. Elara, with her bright eyes and pigtails, was his constant companion, his sister in all but blood. They'd chase fireflies in the twilight, share secrets whispered in the loft of the barn, and make promises with the solemn gravity only children possess. "I'll always keep you safe, Lara," he remembered saying, his chest puffed out with a boy's earnest bravado. Her smile had been his son. Bartholomew Thorn had been the shadow on the edge of this idyllic picture. A neighboring rancher with an insatiable appetite for land, Thorn saw Abram's prosperity not with respect, but with envy. He'd ride over, his smiles thin, and his offers to buy the farm laced with veiled threats. "This land is stubborn, Abram," Thorn would say, looking out over the flourishing crops. "It takes a certain kind of man to tame it, a stronger man." Abram would just smile politely and refuse, his roots in that soil running too deep to be bought. The memory sharpened, focusing on the night it all ended. The air was thick with the smell of an approaching storm, but the fire came first. It started in the barn, a bright, hungry orange that devoured the dry timber with terrifying speed. He remembered waking to Abram's shouts, the frantic screaming of the horses. Abram had sent him to get Elara out of the house while he tried to save the animals. Silas had grabbed her hand, the same hand he had held so many times, and pulled her out into the yard as the flames leaped from the barn to the house, consuming their world in a roar of destruction. The last thing he ever saw of Abram was his silhouette against the fire, a hero swallowed by hell. When the smoke cleared and the sun rose on a landscape of ash and ruin, Thorn was there with the sheriff. They found a lantern, one Silas had used earlier that evening, near the origin point of the fire in the barn. It was a simple, damning piece of evidence. Thorn's voice was slick with false sympathy as he painted the picture. The orphan boy, careless or perhaps malicious, starting the fire that killed his benefactor. The sheriff, a man who always sided with power, saw an easy solution. Silas saw the trap closing. He was 15, a black boy with no one to speak for him, accused of killing the only white man who had ever shown him true kindness. He knew what awaited him, a swift trial and a shorter rope. So he ran. He looked at Alara one last time, her face streaked with soot and tears, her eyes wide with a confusion and horror he couldn't explain, and he fled into the wilderness. The names they shouted after him: murderer, ingrate, branding him forever. That was the day C died and Silas was born, forged in the fires of injustice and tempered by a desperate will to survive. He learned that the only law that mattered was the one worn on his hip. The only trust he could afford was in his own speed and aim. The memory receded, leaving him leaning against the wall in Redemption Gulch, the cold reality of the present crashing back in. He finally understood. Thorn hadn't just profited from the tragedy. He had orchestrated it. He had taken everything from them, their home, their father, their future, and now he was feeding on the remains. The decision settled upon him not like a lightning strike, but like the slow, inexorable setting of the sun. The path of the gunslinger was a solitary one, a forward trajectory that never looked back. To ride away now would be the logical choice, the choice that had kept him alive for over a decade. He could take the money he'd earned from his last bounty, find another dusty town, another glass of whiskey, and let the ghosts of Redemption Gulch fade back into the recesses of his mind. It was the sensible thing to do. It was the Silas thing to do. But as he stood there in the encroaching darkness, the sound of Alara's muffled sobs from the shack was a hook in his soul, pulling him back from the brink of that familiar indifference. He was a man made of scar tissue, each wound a lesson in detachment. He had learned to see people as obstacles or assets, threats or tools. He had convinced himself that the boy named Cy was dead and buried, a casualty of a world that had no room for softness. Yet the memory of Abram's kindness, of Alara's childhood laughter, was a stubborn ember that had never truly been extinguished. It had been buried under layers of ash and cynicism, but Thorn's cruelty had fanned it back to life, and now it glowed with a dangerous heat. He looked at his hands. They were calloused and scarred, hands that had ended lives, that had taken what they needed without asking. They were a killer's hands, but he remembered the mending a fence with Abram, pulling a splinter from Alara's finger, holding a book as he learned to read. They were the same hands. The man was the same man, no matter how much he pretended otherwise. He could not bring Abram back. He could not undo the fire or the 15 years of exile and hardship. He could not give Alara back the life that had been stolen from her, but he could stop the bleeding. He could confront the source of the poison that had infected all their lives. To leave now would not be an act of survival. It would be an act of cowardice, the final betrayal of the boy he was and the man Abram had tried to raise him to be. He would be ratifying Thorn's victory, allowing the lie to stand as truth forever. The moral ambiguity that had defined his life began to clarify. For years, his gun had been a tool for his own preservation, a means to an end in a hostile world. Now, for the first time, it felt like it could be a tool for something else. Not justice, for justice was a clean and noble word for a dirty business, but for a reckoning, a balancing of the scales. He pushed himself off the wall, the decision made. He walked not towards his horse, but towards the faint light of the general store. His stride was unchanged, his expression as impassive as ever, but inside, a fundamental shift had occurred. The lone wolf was turning back to the pack, not as a member, but as its self-appointed grim-faced guardian. Silas was about to remind Redemption Gulch that some debts are not paid with coin. The next morning, Silas's war began not with a gunshot, but with the quiet clang of coins on a wooden counter. He walked into Henderson's general store, the same place where he had seen the owner watch Alara with contempt. The store was the town's nerve center, the hub of commerce and gossip, and his presence immediately sucked the air out of the room. He ignored the sudden silence and the wary eyes of the few other customers. He walked directly to the counter where Henderson was pretending to be busy arranging tins of beans. "Thorn's ledger," Silas said. It was not a request. His voice was low and flat, the sound of stones grinding together. Henderson paled. "I don't know what you're talking about." Silas simply stared at him, his gaze unwavering, his hand resting casually, almost lazily, near the handle of his Colt. It was a posture of immense patient threat. He didn't need to say more. The entire town knew that men like Henderson, who thrived on the scraps from a powerful man's table, were often the keepers of his secrets. After a long, tense moment, Henderson's resolve crumbled. He sweated, his eyes darting towards the door as if hoping Thorne himself would appear. Finally, with trembling hands, he produced a thick, leather-bound book from under the counter. Silas opened it. The pages were filled with names and figures, a meticulous record of Thorne's financial chokehold on the populace. He found her name easily, Elara Miller. The debt was exorbitant, inflated with vague fees and predatory interest. It was a life sentence written in ink. Silas pulled a heavy leather pouch from his duster and emptied a cascade of gold and silver coins onto the counter, the bounty from his last job. "This is for her account," he said. He didn't count it, but he knew it was a significant sum, more money than Henderson's store likely saw in a month. Market paid. Henderson stared at the pile of money, then at Silas, his expression a mixture of fear and avarice. He quickly did as he was told, his pen scratching nervously against the paper. The act sent a shockwave through the town. By midday, everyone knew. The feared gunslinger had paid a portion of the widow's debt. It was an inexplicable act of charity from a man known only for violence. It was a challenge. Thorne received the news in the saloon, and his face, usually a mask of smug control, darkened with fury. His power was not just financial, it was psychological. It relied on the perception of his absolute authority and the hopelessness of his victims. Silas's action had introduced a new, unpredictable variable into the equation: hope. Thorne would not let the challenge go unanswered. That evening, 2 of his hired men, brutish thugs who enforced their boss's will with their fists, paid a visit to Elara's shack. Silas had anticipated it. He was waiting in the shadows nearby, a sentinel in the twilight. He heard their coarse voices, the splintering of the flimsy door as they kicked it in. He heard Elara's cry of fear. He moved then, not with the dramatic flourish of a hero, but with the cold efficiency of a predator. He entered the shack so quietly they didn't hear him over their own taunts and the sound of the boy crying. The 2 thugs had cornered Elara, their hulking forms casting monstrous shadows on the wall in the flickering lamplight. One of them had a fistful of her dress. "Mr. Thorne doesn't like people getting ideas," the man growled, his breath foul with cheap liquor. "He wants you to remember who you belong to." Elara's face was a mask of terror, but she held her ground, her body shielding the pallet where her son was curled in fear. That was when Silas spoke, his voice filling the small space, as cold and sharp as a shard of ice. "Let her go." The 2 men spun around, their surprise turning to sneering confidence when they saw it was just one man. They were big, used to winning fights through sheer size and brutality. They did not yet understand the difference between a brawler and a killer. "Well, look what we have here," the first one said, releasing Elara to square up to Silas. "The Good Samaritan. You lost, friend." "I'm not your friend," Silas stated, his eyes unblinking, his body perfectly still. "And I'm not lost. I told you to let her go." The second thug circled around, trying to flank him. It was a classic barroom tactic, clumsy and obvious. "You made a mistake coming here," the second man sneered, cracking his knuckles. "Thorne's not gonna like this." Silas's gaze didn't waver from the first man. "Thorne makes a lot of mistakes." The first thug lunged, throwing a wide, telegraphed punch. Silas moved with a speed that was almost imperceptible. He didn't dodge. He flowed inside the punch, striking the man's throat with the heel of his hand. The thug choked, his eyes wide with shock and pain, and staggered back, clutching at his neck. Before the second man could react, Silas pivoted, a blur of dark cloth and coiled muscle. He didn't draw his gun. He didn't need to. He delivered a series of short, brutal strikes to the ribs, the jaw, the solar plexus. Each blow landed with a sickening thud, precise and disabling. The man collapsed in a heap, groaning. The first thug, having caught his breath, came at him again, this time with a desperate, wild fury. Silas met his charge, using the man's own momentum against him, and threw him through the flimsy wall of the shack. There was a crash of splintering wood as the man landed in the dust outside. The fight was over in less than a minute. It wasn't a duel. It was a dismantling. Silas stood in the wreckage, his breathing even, his expression unchanged. The silence that followed was broken only by the whimpering of the child. Ilara stared at him, her terror now mixed with a profound, disbelieving awe. She was looking at the instrument of Thorn's will, broken and defeated, and at the quiet, deadly man who had done it. For the first time, she looked past the fearsome reputation, past the gun and the grim face, and saw something else. A protector. A flicker of recognition, not of his face, but of his actions, ignited in her eyes. The boy who had promised to keep her safe so long ago was gone, but in his place stood this man, a far more dangerous and perhaps more effective guardian. The public humiliation of his men was a declaration of war Thorn could not ignore. The fragile peace of Redemption Gulch shattered. The next day, Thorn didn't send his lackeys. He came himself, flanked by the sheriff and 3 more hired guns. They found Silas in the center of the main street, standing as if he had been waiting for them. The townspeople scurried for cover, peering from behind curtains and out of saloon doors. The street, moments before bustling with morning activity, became a dusty, silent stage. Thorn reined in his horse, his face purple with rage. "Silas!" he boomed, his voice echoing off the false-fronted buildings. He spat the name like a curse. "I should have known it was you, the ungrateful whelp who murdered his benefactor and ran like a coward." The accusation, the old lie, was thrown down like a gauntlet. The sheriff shifted uneasily, his hand on his gun, his loyalty to Thorn now putting him in the direct path of a known killer. Silas remained motionless, his duster barely stirring in the still air. His face was a mask, but his eyes were fixed on Thorn, burning with an intensity that spanned 15 years of injustice. "You know what happened that night, Thorn." Silas's voice was quiet, yet it carried across the street with chilling clarity. "You were there. You watched it burn." Thorn laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. "I watched a tragedy of your making. You destroyed the finest family this valley has ever known, and now you come back to poison this town, to turn that poor, simple-minded woman's head with your blood money." He was playing to the crowd, reinforcing the narrative they had accepted for years. He was the town patriarch, the protector. Silas was the interloper, the original sin. But Silas was no longer the frightened boy who had run from the lie. He was a man who had lived with its consequences, and he would not let it stand. "You wanted the land, Thorn," Silas said, each word a carefully placed stone. "Abram wouldn't sell, so you took it. You lit the fire, knowing the blame would fall on me. You left a good man to die and his daughter with nothing." A gasp went through the hidden audience. It was a truth so audacious, so contrary to the town's founding myth, that it was stunning. Thorn's face contorted, the mask of civic leader slipping to reveal the predator beneath. "Lies! Slander from a murderer!" he roared, his hand dropping towards the fancy silver-inlaid pistol at his own hip. "Sheriff, arrest this man." The sheriff, sweating profusely, took a hesitant step forward. "Now, Silas, let's not have any." He never finished the sentence. Silas's draw was not a movement. It was a thought made manifest. The Colt seemed to leap into his hand. A single shot cracked through the silence, not at Thorn, but at the dust near the sheriff's feet. The sheriff froze, his hand dropping from his gun as if it had been burned. The other hired guns, who had been tensing for a fight, hesitated. They were paid to be tough, but they were not paid to die for Thorn's lie. They saw the cold certainty in Silas's eyes and knew this was not a fight they could win. The street was caught in a moment of pure, crystalline tension. It was Silas against Thorn. The past against the present. The lie against the truth. "It's just you and me, Thorn," Silas said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Just like it should have been all those years ago." For the first time, Thorn looked afraid. His power, built on money and intimidation, was useless against a man with nothing left to lose and a single, burning purpose. He had orchestrated a fire to steal a man's legacy, and now he was facing a ghost forged in those very flames. The dust settled, leaving behind a silence that was heavier than any sound. Thorn and his men lay still on the ground that he had fought so dishonorably to control. The townspeople slowly emerged from their hiding places, their faces a mixture of shock, fear, and a dawning, uncertain relief. They looked at the bodies, and then they looked at Silas. He stood alone in the center of the street, the smoke still curling from the barrel of his gun. He was no hero. The violence had been swift, brutal, and ugly. It was not a victory to be celebrated, but a grim task completed. A cancer cut out. He was wounded, a searing pain in his side where one of Thorne's bullets had grazed him. But the deeper wound was the one that had been festering for 15 years, and it had finally been lanced. He saw Ilara standing in the doorway of her shack, her son clinging to her skirt. Her eyes met his across the dusty expanse. The fear that had lived in them for so long was gone, replaced by a profound, heartbreaking understanding. She saw it all now. The boy who ran, the man who returned, the terrible price he had paid, and the terrible price he had just exacted. There were no words to be said. An apology would be too small, an explanation too late. Their shared history was written there in the dust and the blood. He walked towards her, each step an effort. The townspeople parted for him, their whispers dying as he passed. He stopped a few feet from her, the silence between them stretching, filled with the ghosts of who they had been, and the uncertainty of who they could now become. He reached into his duster and pulled out the ledger from Henderson's store. He opened it to the page with her name and tore it out, letting the paper, the symbol of her bondage, fall to the ground. "It's over," he said, his voice rough. "You're free." She looked from the paper to his face, at the exhaustion etched there, at the pain in his eyes. He had given her back her life, the leftovers of a feast that Thorne had greedily consumed. She took a step forward, her hand reaching out not in supplication this time, but in a gesture of simple human connection. She gently touched the wound in his side, her fingers coming away with his blood. "Silas," she whispered, saying his name for the first time. Not the name of the feared gunslinger, but the name of the man who had returned from the dead to keep a childhood promise. He did not know if he would stay. The life of a gunslinger was not one that could be easily shed, and the blood he had spilled today would have its own consequences. But as he looked at Ilara and her son, a future he had never dared to imagine flickered at the edge of his vision. It was not a promise of happiness, but the possibility of healing. The lone gunman had acted not for gold or for reputation, but for the memory of kindness. In freeing her, he had taken the first step toward freeing himself.